Margaret had lived in the same wealthy neighborhood for over 60 years. She had seen the world change around her, but she never changed with it. She believed things were better in the past. The people were different, the values were stronger, and everyone knew their place, as she often said. Margaret wasn't just set in her ways, she was proud of them. She made no effort to hide her beliefs. If she didn't like someone, she let them know. Neighbors avoided unnecessary conversations with her. Some tolerated her because she had been in the community for so long, but no one truly liked her. She didn't care. Every morning, Margaret followed the same routine. She woke up, made herself a strong cup of tea, and looked out her window. She often complained about how different the neighborhood had become. There were too many outsiders, as she called them. She missed the days when she only saw people who looked like her. Margaret rarely left her house unless she had to. She didn't like the stores being filled with people from other backgrounds. She hated interacting with workers she believed didn't belong. But today she had no choice. She needed a few groceries, so she grabbed her purse and left. As she walked into her usual grocery store, she looked around with distaste. Too many people. Too many different accents. She sighed, already irritated. Margaret wasn't just shopping for food. She was looking for a reason to complain. And it wouldn't take long for her to find one. Margaret walked down the aisles, pushing her cart slowly. She wasn't in a rush, but she also wasn't in a good mood. She glanced at the other shoppers and shook her head. She didn't like how much the neighborhood had changed over the years. It didn't feel like home anymore. She muttered under her breath, "Used to be different around here." As she reached the produce section, a young black cashier stood nearby, stocking apples. He smiled politely and asked, "Good afternoon, ma'am. Need any help?" Margaret frowned. She didn't like being approached, especially not by him. She scoffed and waved her hand. "No, I don't need help." The cashier nodded and went back to his work. Margaret turned her attention to the fruit, but she wasn't done. She mumbled just loud enough for him to hear. "People don't want to work these days, but they're always standing around." The young man heard it. He glanced at her for a second but said nothing. He had dealt with customers like her before. Another customer, a middle-aged woman, stood nearby and heard the comment. She sighed and shook her head. But like most people, she stayed quiet. Confronting Margaret wasn't worth the trouble. Margaret picked up a few apples and dropped them into her cart. She continued shopping, still irritated. As she made her way to the checkout, she felt a strange sensation in her chest. A tightness. A little pain. She ignored it. Probably just heartburn. She reached the register and sighed as she saw the young cashier again. He was bagging groceries. Margaret exhaled sharply, feeling the pain intensify. She grabbed the edge of the counter, her vision blurring. Then, everything went black. The store was filled with panic as people rushed to Margaret's side. Her body crumpled to the ground, lifeless, and the once busy aisles now felt like a chaotic scene from a movie. A nearby shopper knelt beside her, checking for a pulse. He couldn't find one. "Somebody call 911. He shouted. A woman, trembling, pulled out her phone and dialed the emergency number, her voice shaking as she explained the situation. Meanwhile, a young employee ran over to Margaret, bending down to try and revive her. Her name was Emily, and though she had no formal medical training, she had seen enough to know what to do. She started performing CPR, hoping to keep Margaret alive long enough for the paramedics to arrive. Others stood around, not knowing how to help, but too afraid to leave. Some whispered to each other, speculating what might have caused the collapse. "Is she all right?" a man asked as he watched from a few feet away. "I don't know," someone else replied, eyes wide with worry. A few moments later, sirens blared in the distance. The ambulance had arrived. Margaret was carefully lifted onto a stretcher, and her breathing was still shallow, barely noticeable. Emily stepped back, exhausted and unsure if she had done enough. The paramedics moved quickly, not wasting any time. They rushed Margaret outside to the waiting ambulance, and the doors slammed shut behind them. As they sped off toward the hospital, Emily couldn't help but wonder if she had just witnessed something much worse than she first realized. She felt a pit in her stomach. But Margaret's life was now in the hands of the doctors and nurses at the hospital. Emily could only hope they would be able to save her. Back in the grocery store, the customers who had witnessed the event began to slowly return to their shopping. But the incident lingered in their minds. Margaret woke up in a sterile, bright room. The first thing she noticed was the sharp scent of disinfectant in the air. Her body felt heavy, like it had been through a battle. She blinked a few times, trying to clear the fog from her mind, and realized she wasn't at the grocery store anymore. She wasn't even at home. Where am I?" she whispered hoarsely. A voice answered from beside her, calm and professional. "You're in the hospital, ma'am. You had a heart attack, but we've stabilized you." Margaret turned her head, barely able to focus on the figure standing by her bed. He was tall, dressed in a white coat, and his face was calm and kind, but something about him made Margaret uncomfortable. She couldn't place it right away, but there it was, a slight unease creeping into her thoughts. He smiled at her. "I'm Dr. Carter, and I'm here to make sure you recover." Her eyes narrowed when she heard the name. A black doctor. Her heart skipped a beat, not from any medical concern, but from the immediate judgment that rushed through her mind. "I don't want you working on me," Margaret mumbled, her voice trembling slightly. Dr. Carter didn't flinch. He simply nodded, his face unreadable. "I understand that you might feel uncomfortable, ma'am, but I assure you, I'm highly qualified. I'm the head of cardiology here. I'm the best person for the job." Margaret ignored him, turning her face away. She wasn't about to let a man like him, someone she believed didn't belong, take control of her care. "Get me a real doctor," she said coldly. Dr. Carter remained calm, his professionalism unwavering. "I assure you, I'm a real doctor. But if you want, I can have one of my colleagues come in and speak with you." But Margaret wasn't listening. She just wanted someone who looked like her to take over. As she looked away, she felt the weight of her situation. She knew she was in serious trouble, but the idea of putting her life in the hands of a black man filled her with an anger she couldn't explain. The room grew quieter as Dr. Carter continued to monitor her vitals. Margaret could hear the soft beeping of the heart monitor, a sound she suddenly found unsettling. She tried to ignore it, but it made her feel more vulnerable, more aware of the gravity of her situation. The doctor moved around the room, making notes on the clipboard. Margaret watched him, her eyes narrowing. "What's going on with me?" she asked, her voice shaky but demanding. Dr. Matt Carter didn't seem bothered by her tone. He looked up at her and spoke calmly. "You've suffered a heart attack, Mrs. Hawkins. Your heart stopped for several minutes, but we managed to get it beating again." Margaret frowned. Her mind raced as the information sank in, but she still didn't trust him. "I told you, I don't want you working on me." Dr. Carter continued as if she hadn't spoken. "We've done a full workup, and the test results came back with some concerning news. You have a blocked artery that led to the heart attack. It's serious, and you'll need immediate surgery." Margaret's eyes widened at the mention of surgery. "What kind of surgery?" she asked, her voice trembling now. Dr. Carter glanced at her, his expression still calm but firm. "We'll need to clear the blockage and repair the damage. It's the only way to prevent another heart attack, or worse." Margaret's heart pounded, and she suddenly felt the weight of her mortality press down on her. "I don't want you doing it," she said, almost a whisper. "Get me another doctor. I don't care who it is, but not you." Dr. Carter remained unfazed. "Mrs. Hawkins, I understand your concerns, but waiting for another doctor could put your life in danger. The longer we wait, the worse it could get. I'm the best person to perform this surgery, and we need to act fast." Margaret didn't respond. She was silent, caught between the need to stay alive and the prejudice she couldn't seem to shake off. Her head spun as the reality of the situation set in. She didn't want him touching her, but deep down, she knew he was the one who could save her life. Dr. Carter stood at the foot of Margaret's bed, silently waiting for her response. She still refused to look at him, her eyes fixed on the sterile white wall across the room. The silence between them hung heavy, but he didn't let it deter him. Margaret's body was failing her, and time was slipping away. The block in her artery wasn't going to fix itself. "I'm starting the preparations for surgery," Dr. Carter finally said, his voice firm but gentle. "You don't have to agree right now, but I'll need your cooperation. We're going to get through this, but it has to be done now." Margaret felt a wave of frustration wash over her, but she knew he was right. Deep down, she knew she couldn't waste any more time. She wanted to scream, to demand someone else. But the truth was, she was scared. Her life was on the line, and the anger she had toward Dr. Carter seemed so small in comparison to what she was facing. Dr. Carter moved with purpose, coordinating with the nurses as they prepared the operating room. Margaret couldn't escape the thoughts that raced through her mind, but the hospital was no place for pride. As they wheeled her into the operating room, Margaret's eyes remained closed. She could hear the voices around her, the soft buzz of equipment, and the controlled chaos of a surgery team. She didn't want to acknowledge the fact that she was about to be operated on by the very man she had tried to reject, but in the end, she had no choice. Dr. Carter stood over her, his hands steady as he began the procedure. The team worked seamlessly, knowing exactly what needed to be done. There was no room for hesitation, no room for second-guessing. "We're going to take care of you, Mrs. Hawkins," Dr. Carter said quietly as he made the first incision. His words were reassuring, even though Margaret still refused to meet his gaze. Her life was in his hands now, and there was no turning back. Margaret slowly regained consciousness. Her mind felt foggy, and the first thing she was aware of was a dull ache in her chest. Her breathing was shallow, and she struggled to focus her eyes. "What happened?" she muttered, her voice weak and raspy. A soft, reassuring voice answered. "You're in recovery, Mrs. Hawkins. The surgery went well. Dr. Carter was able to clear the blockage and repair the damage to your heart." Margaret blinked, still groggy. She wasn't sure if she was dreaming or if this was real. She tried to move, but her body felt heavy. As her mind cleared, she noticed the presence of someone standing beside her bed. It was Dr. Carter. His expression was calm and professional, but there was something else in his eyes, a hint of concern, mixed with relief. "You're alive," he said softly. "You made it through. Everything went as planned." Margaret's heart pounded in her chest, but not from the medical procedures. It was the realization that the man she had rejected, the one she had looked down on, was the reason she was still here. She didn't know what to say. Part of her still wanted to hold on to the pride that kept her from trusting him, but the truth was right in front of her. "Thank you," she whispered, almost too quietly for him to hear. Dr. Carter smiled gently. "You're welcome, I'm just glad you're okay." Margaret's mind raced, her thoughts tangled. She had no choice but to accept the truth now. The man she had once refused was the one who had saved her life, and in that moment, she couldn't deny it anymore.